Okay, so now we've got our final presentation of the day. We've got artist and sculptor Alison Smith with Christopher Hassell from Animal Biology. So do stay with us after this and we'll have our panel discussion as well. So hope you're all still thinking of questions.
Hi everyone, so I should make the obligatory apology for following the dancers who are absolutely tremendous. There are about 3 people in the audience who have seen me dance, and you will all know, those 3, that it requires far more alcohol than I have consumed so far to get me onto the dance floor. So maybe later, but not quite now. What instead I'm going to talk about is the work that Alison and I have been talking about doing over the last couple of months. And whether by accident or design, we started off with the microbial underpinnings of, the molecular underpinnings of microbial resistance to antibiotics. And we're going to end with the work that Alison and I have been talking about in terms of ecosystems and land art, almost. So I think Alison's going to start off talking a little bit about where she came from. I'll talk about where I came from, and then we'll run you through a portfolio of work that we've designed, which we're going to be developing, hopefully, over the next couple of months.
Yeah, so just to give you a bit of background in terms of where we're both kind of coming from, what our interests are. The reason I wanted to get involved in the Creative Labs was because I create light installations and sculptural lighting mainly out of recycled materials, and almost all of them are kind of inspired by or based on organic shapes and forms and textures, including things like coral reefs, plant life, and ice formations and frost crystals. So I get pretty much all my inspiration from nature. So working with a biological scientist was, a real gift. Also, my work has an ecological kind of narrative to it, especially pieces like the indestructible reef that you can see up in the top corner, is a coral reef created entirely out of waste, recycled plastic, which is obviously kind of commenting on the idea that the oceans are becoming more and more filled with plastic that's not going to take hundreds of years to break down. So kind of trying to get through some messages through these sculptural lighting pieces. Once Chris and I had met and we'd started discussing the different things we were working on, in particular the Born in Bradford project, which Chris and a team of academics are also working on, we realised there was lots of other crossovers within our practice. So Born in Bradford and the work that Chris is doing on that project is looking at green space and urban green spaces, and how people use them and interact with them and how they can benefit nature and people alike. A lot of my pieces that I've done so far have been exhibited in urban green spaces. So a piece that I've just been exhibited recently for the Leeds Bid Christmas campaign was in Park Square, which some of you may know, a small Georgian park in Leeds city centre, and so I've done quite a few different outdoor exhibitions, so working in nature, in a natural setting, but often in an urban environment as well. Another big crossover was, as well as my own practice, I do a lot of work with children and young people and communities, and do a lot of work for an organisation based in Leeds called Playful Anywhere. You may have seen shipping containers with interesting, playful things happening in and outside of them around Leeds. And if you have, that's through Playful. We have a play box, and we now have another one called Toy Box, which is bright yellow, and I'm currently artist in residence on that project. A lot of the work we do with Playbox and Toy Box is in urban green spaces, so really neglected little parks. We plonk down a shipping container full of art stuff, creative stuff, play, equipment, and we do lots and lots of different sort of public activities and workshops and sessions with those containers. So once I found out a bit more about Born in Bradford, I thought, wow, there's so much potential here for us to collaborate in terms of whether that's collecting data, whether that's interventions in parks, using the kind of shipping container model as a potential platform, I guess. So that's where I came from. Chris?
My research originally started off with biodiversity, ecology, evolution. I was interested in how the ecosystems that we see today came to be. Over time, I've become more and more interested in how human activity impacts on those ecosystems. And that's led me to the sort of work that Alison and I have been talking about. So here we have, in the top left, as a Victorian photo, postcard of Peel Park in Bradford. And in the lower left corner, you can see a very common school playing field with a couple of goalposts. The commonalities between them are that they are largely grass. Ecologists would generally refer to this as green concrete. It has really limited biodiversity value, and yet it's what we choose to pave large areas of our green space with, to the extent that it is really space that is green rather than space that is natural. And that's compounded really when we have limited access to space. So all the images on the right-hand side, there are 10 of them, those are all school grounds. Those are actually schools largely inhabited by kids who are part of the Born in Bradford project. So we know quite a lot about them. What we also know from the work that we've been doing in my lab is that they have very little access to green space at all. So anything green colored is either trees or grass on those diagrams. The blues and the grays are all different types of concrete or buildings. So you can see that some schools are almost completely devoid of greenery. So I think some of the pairings have come together and thought, how on earth can we reconcile this artistic medium with this detailed scientific concept? I think Alison and I started talking and immediately saw what we could do together. There's all kinds of exciting opportunities to be able to take interesting creative approaches to enhancing green space that can use nature to enhance the space both for biodiversity and for people. So I think if we go on to the next slide. Do you want to talk about it too first?
So these are just a few of the different artists that Chris and I have been sharing and discussing. We kind of started looking at different land art and ecological art. So the ones that I've kind of shared with Chris are Andy Goldsworthy, who's a very well-known land artist, who, if you are not aware of his work, he kind of creates temporal sculptures. So we'll go into a natural setting, arrange some natural materials in a sort of sculptural way or a pattern. This piece obviously is some sticks on a tree. He also works in ice, he works with rocks, he works with leaves. So I showed Chris some of these pieces of work and that idea that they are completely natural in terms of the materials they're made from. They are arranged without any kind of fixings, usually. They're just arranged and balanced very, very carefully, and therefore will break down over time some of them quite quickly. The ice sculptures will literally just melt within a day. So that idea of it being a very temporal intervention in that space. And Julie Dodd is a sculptor who works in paper. She does lots and lots of different really interesting three-dimensional pieces inspired by blood cells and fungus, which is something that I'm really want to get more into fungus.
She really wants to get
I really want to get into fungus. And this piece is has an ecological vein as well, which is around palm oil and felling of trees and the kind of deforestation around palm oil. So we've kind of shared a few of those different ideas.
So the two artists that I came across recently that really interested me in land art were... Oh, sorry, yeah, can we skip that? Yeah, so Basia Erland's piece in the top right called Reading the River. So this is a book made of water frozen from the river that you can see behind it. And embedded within that book are seeds of local native species. And written on the book is a series of poems that she wrote about those specific rivers. And during the piece, she releases the ice. It forms a miniature iceberg that floats downriver, releasing the seeds as it goes. So it's all about cycling of water and understanding the nature of the ecosystem. Aviva Rahmani, if you ever get a chance to read about the Blue Tree Symphony, I won't bore you with it now, but come talk to me afterwards, because I find it absolutely fascinating. Effectively, what she did was create a landscape-scale piece of music, and because of the nature of copyright law, she argued, by creating music in these trees, which are marked out in different patterns, it could not be destroyed by the company that was trying to lay a power line through it. So it's an interesting little piece of artistic guerrilla warfare, I guess, trying to protect the environment. So yeah, I'm really interested in art as well, but it's been interesting to exchange those kinds of ideas with Alison. Yep. Is this me? Yep. So we came up with, as I say, this portfolio of work based around our mutual interests, and it falls sort of into two different categories. So this first, we're going to talk about how we can use art to enhance biodiversity. So thinking about the role of objects within natural spaces, but also thinking about how we can give ownership of those objects and those spaces to local communities, encouraging participation. If we can skip again. So the first of these is combining Alison's use of plastic and the sort of household debris, really, with their use, or perhaps non-use in many cases, unfortunately, of the local green spaces. So here you can see a variety of different ways in which everyday household plastic objects have been used to create habitats and spaces for plants. In top left, there's an example of some vertical gardens. We've got a few green walls of different designs and complexities, and some of the sketches that Alison's produced of ways in which we can create these, not so that they don't look like plants in an old bottle, but so that they can become art in and of themselves. This allows people to bring along their own contribution to the art piece through planting seeds in their own plastic waste, and in so doing, create something collaboratively as a community which enhances the biodiversity in the area.
And we also looked at habitats for wildlife. So we started discussing a few different ideas. I'd come across, I'm sure many people have seen them or might have them, insect hotels, and the way that they can create different habitats for environment where the kind of green concrete, as Chris has mentioned, is not particularly, it's not very good at promoting biodiversity in one of those urban spaces. So we've designed a few different ideas for potential kind of insect hotels, some of which, as well as Chris has said, could be kind of quite participatory. So we could be addressing public awareness whilst creating something artistic and sculptural that then could be put into an urban green space and installed as a kind of permanent piece within maybe the flower beds or within the gardens. So things like these kind of spherical things. A lot of my work seems to be spherical. Anything round, I kind of cotton on to. So we've come up with some potential ideas for that. Also, you can see some of the, this is an Arup Associates project in London. There was I think it was British Land, have done a competition called Beyond the Hive, where they've invited architects and designers to design insect hotels for public green spaces. So I kind of took some inspiration from some of the things that they created. This piece up here, the sort of birdhouses, is a piece called Control Tower by a sculptor called Cameron Hawkinson. And I really like that idea of kind of creating something sculptural that could also create habitat for wildlife. Whether or not that was actually used by birds, I don't know. It could just, I think it might just, it might have ended up being used by birds. But we were discussing how you could use different shapes or different combinations of shapes to create something similar. So we've come up with this kind of design that was inspired by kind of wasp nests or nests of paper wasps. We then got really into this idea last week and were discussing how you could create a sort of structure, these multiples that are kind of lots and lots of different sizes, potentially different materials, potentially even just wire bases, and then just see what happens. Put them out there, see what species decide they want to use them. We thought you could put various different ones up in the same space. You could have one that the squirrels take over. Apparently squirrels are good at taking over things. You could have one that may become a bee's nest. You could have some of them might end up being a great tit will come along and then be really territorial and no one else can use that particular collection of habitat. So we kind of were developing lots of ideas around that kind of variegation, giving a really varied environment for wildlife to inhabit. The Paper Wasps project as well, this picture down the bottom right, is a really interesting experiment that was done by a biology student, actually. I thought he was an artist originally, but it was a PhD biology student in Italy. And he gave paper wasps some coloured paper, and they started making rainbow nests. So that idea of kind of collaborating with nature and providing a shell and some raw material and just seeing what happens, seeing what the wildlife in that park decide to do with it. So that's a really interesting vein that we've come across. So the next sort of set of ideas that we started toying with were things around small things. So as I kind of said at the beginning, one of my real kind of interests is in texture and form and structure. So I was really keen to get involved in kind of looking at things on a microscopic level. Also, as I've kind of started to mention already, that idea of collaborating with nature, how can you involve bacteria or insects in kind of your creative process and sort of allow them to take it over in some way. And then looking at water, so a lot of Chris's specialisms are around kind of fresh water, so we were looking at how we could work in and with water as well. So we started, I kind of interviewed Chris and asked him a few different questions that had popped up. One being, a lot of my work plants, ice, coral. It's large, it's quite obviously beautiful. You know, we all kind of know that coral reefs are a ridiculously beautiful object. So I really wanted to know, where is the kind of unexpected beauty? Where do you find things in sort of your work that you think, wow, that's really, really beautiful? And, you know, no one else can kind of see that. Obviously, microscopic things being a big thing. Diatoms, which are algae and plankton, and I've been trying to sort of learn what they actually are. Single-celled organisms, but they are very, very beautiful and very varied. So come in a whole massive array of colours and textures and shapes. And so much so that in the Victorian era, hobbyists began arranging them in patterns. So this image here and these two on this side are diatom art. So apparently Victorian ladies would get an eyelash and a microscope and arrange the diatoms on a microscopic plate into a pattern. Some of them are like floral arrangements. It's kind of amazing. So Chris is very keen that I revive diatom art. Apparently there is one practicing man in this country, so I think maybe I need to get a microscope and start playing with diatoms. But also I see the potential for large sculptural forms that are lit from within, which is what a lot of my sort of sculptures end up being, of diatoms, and then have kind of gone down that vein into plankton in general as well. So as a kind of development of my coral reef, that I could create a light installation that's lots and lots of different types of plankton, all created out of plastic. And kind of continuing that narrative of plastics in the ocean, and the fact that microplastics are one of the biggest problems that we're now discovering is a much bigger problem than we ever thought it was. So there's a whole load of amazing things that we can do with diatoms, and Chris's working title is just genius.
That's my contribution. Actually, you can keep this again. This next project is perhaps my favourite. As Alison was saying, a lot of my work at the moment is focusing on urban freshwaters, and in particular urban ponds, everything from garden ponds a couple of feet square up to the sort of park lakes that you see at the bottom here, and that I showed on the opening slides. And the notion that we could take the sort of coral reef ideas that Alison's been building over the last few years and immerse them, actually create urban reefs which could be lit, really, really excites me, because if the grass, this amenity grassland found in so many of our parks is like urban concrete, then the ponds that we find in urban parks they're like toilets, really. They're horrible places, and this park in particular, Bradford Moor Park, that pond is awful. And for an ecologist to look at that, you can understand why people don't care about them. It's the old broken windows fallacy. They see something broken and so they don't value it, and so we don't do anything about it. And I love the idea of using something creative so that we can bring people in and have them appreciate the potential that these wonderful urban blue spaces can bring, if only we were to look after them and do something interesting and exciting with them. We'd also talked about, and I think this will come in the next slide as well when Alison comes to talk about the final idea, putting in plain plastic and allowing the algal communities to colonize it. Because on the left-hand side here, you can see these are Red Sea corals, and they fluoresce naturally. And they produce these wonderful patterns, both under daylight, which is on the left-hand side, and under UV on the right. So the notion that we could create something with nature, again, working in urban ponds, I find really exciting.
Yeah, we got kind of quite excited when we realised that if we submersed a coral sculpture, a plastic coral sculpture, in some and let the algae colonize it, that we could then have a branched coral sculpture that then when you go look through a microscope, the diatoms would then potentially form branches on its surface, and you can kind of go macro, micro, kind of levels and levels of pattern in kind of that collaboration with nature. And then this idea was literally one that we started talking about last week, which was, again, collaborating with nature and using light. So how could we use kind of tanks of algae or tanks of invertebrates and project light through it, create a kind of light installation just by using what's in a tank and allowing people to kind of see the beauty in the kind of structures or the patterns or just the very kind of blobby shapes that you could have if you have a whole load of there's some kind of micro shrimp that I found on the internet, swimming around in a tank. I also then started looking into the kind of living lights, which is quite a lot of designers are looking at the moment. This one at the top is using spirulina algae, which glows and kind of purifies the air. It kind of exchanges, it's a sort of a biofuel in itself. So there's some really interesting projects going on in this kind of area already. This really beautiful piece is a chandelier made out of glass leaves that are filled with water and algae, and is also an air purifying light as well. So there's lots of really amazing stuff happening, but we kind of feel this kind of test, this sketch on the top right, is something that we can do really quickly, really easily. We can just play around, shine some light through some algae or some bacteria and see what happens. So definitely something that we can get cracking on quite soon. So in terms of what I've learned, I feel like we're still going. I don't feel like we've finished in any sense of the word yet. So I kind of was a bit like, it's really hard to look back on what I've learned because I feel like I'm still learning it all and the process is really kind of just starting. I feel like within my own practice is quite young. I've only really created about 3 or 4 different installations to date, and so I know that I'm only scratching the surface in terms of the things that I can think of. But then having my horizons broadened by working with Chris and some of the other academics, it's kind of just a whole new, just so many potential ideas and avenues that we could go down, which is amazing. And the first kind of collaborative project I've worked on in terms of my artistic practice as well. So really learning what the potential of collaborations can bring, and working with someone who's, from such a different discipline is just a total gift. It's absolutely amazing. We've talked a lot about urban space. We've talked a lot about green space and biodiversity. I've learned a lot about that. I've learned that, we kind of need to be a bit more innovative with our urban green spaces because they are all a little bit samey and not really doing what they should be doing. I've definitely got a new passion for experimenting, but also one thing that I forgot to write on here last night was that we were talking a lot about that kind of ecological impact of art. So land art or art that is within a natural setting, that it's not always easy to know what's going to happen to it. How are the wildlife going to interact with it? What's the potential damage that could be doing to the environment? The piece I've just had in Park Square was made out of recycled packing foam. It was hung in the trees for 6 weeks, and I knew that if that was there year round, that would potentially then cause problems. You would have birds pulling bits of foam out to go and make nests with, or you would have it would cause litter. So I was really interested to know what the ecological impact of my artwork could be, and we started discussing that a little bit, and we think there's a lot more there in that there are a lot of artists working in natural environments, and having some way of helping artists to be more ecologically aware in terms of their work and their practice is definitely something that we feel there's a lot of mileage in.
I think for me, I'm not quite the stereotype of an uncultured scientist, but I'm 99% of the way there, and I'd like to think that this experience has brought me at least to about 90% uncultured scientist. I was aware of some ecological art, but mostly from an external perspective looking in, and what I've learned, I think, by working with Alison is a little bit more about how the art is created, the method rather than the final end piece, and that's been really fascinating for me. Especially in this age of encouraged interdisciplinary collaborations for scientists. We're forever being told to collaborate with artists, and I think the barrier really is not understanding what art is, but how art comes to be. So in that sense, I think that's been really useful for me, hearing about just the commissioning process. How does a piece of art come to be from scratch? We've shared lots of ideas around land art, and I've got lots of names to go and look around at. Spent more time than I ever have on Pinterest, checking out all these sites. But also, as Alison was saying, the sorts of media that people are using to create their ecological art, is it plastic, is it green, where do these resources come from? Can we use waste, both green and artificial, to work with nature to create new art? And then thinking about science through art, where I actually happen to be working on a grant proposal which is due in very soon on light pollution. So it's interesting to be working with an artist who uses light as a basis for their sculpture, and ways in which we might be able to incorporate that, whether it's into the experiment or into the outreach. But also the notion of living art and how we can the art itself can contribute to biodiversity. Alison's already talked about these ideas of diatoms and biofilms and the macro and the micro, and how we can look at these natural geometries that I study from an ecological perspective, but Alison's interested in the form rather than necessarily the function. So I think I have 1 minute left. So these are the things, and we were absolutely right in our timing that we don't have time to talk about these things. Very quickly, neglected waste streams, things like Tetra Paks, very difficult to recycle in Leeds, and so that's a great waste stream if we want to create something out of a source that's very difficult to recycle. Biofilms I've talked about, fascinating at a micro level. We really don't understand much about their ecology as well, so there's some interesting opportunities for working together there. The council spends way too much time mowing its lawns, and that means that we get heaps and heaps and heaps of green waste that we can use. But it's a complex waste to use because of the rate that it decays and the problems that it's caused. And this buzzing bush is something that Alison has been, I think, talking about for a little while now. But it's introducing other sensory modalities into the sort of art that we're talking about. So not just the smells of plants and not just the sight of plants and natural objects, but also trying to create a holistic sensory experience from these installations. So that's everything. Thank you very much for your attention.